Okay. Some of the things that she talked about after you watch the video, I know it was 40 minutes long or so, but it's a really great video. Please watch it all. When she talked about how most people are diagnosed with gambling disorder have other diagnoses that are related to behavioral disorders. In general, when she was talking about the behavioral disorders such as ADHD, mood disorders, bipolar disorder, one of the things that we don't talk about is even though people are diagnosed with these disorders, we particularly think that that is just their problem. Very often do we not even ask about gambling. She mentioned the other gambling assessments that we have now. Okay, we have a lot of gambling assessments that we have not had. The South Oaks gambling screener. Okay, she also talked about that we have to keep in mind that the biology and the psychology of addiction are often inseparable in our fields. What do we mean by that? We can see further that, in particular, that addiction takes place and may take a matter of availability, and it comes with the opportunity of the chance of you being able to get to the drug. I want you to start thinking of drugs like that in regard, and not just think of it as drugs, but also think of it as these behaviors that are addictive. Gambling, eating disorders, pornography, sex addiction. Okay, so whether the addiction is a substance such as heroin or a behavior such as gambling, the pattern is more or less the same. If we can make that transition, that the pattern is the same, I think we'll be progressing. In this chapter uh, of the book, and I'm going to toggle between her video and what we have in the book, she looked at as what the book looks at as well, the commonalities and the uniqueness of the varieties of addiction and gambling addiction. She correlated it a lot with eating disorders, shopping addiction, and sex addiction, as well as other compulsive behaviors. One of the things that the book has that we basically assume that in this chapter is that one of the most effective therapeutic practices is for these kind of addictions in general is a cognitive based approach. As you remember in the video, she talked about trauma informed cognitive behavioral therapy, which is trauma focused, which I think does better with giving you what you need. But also what she talked about is how when we as clinicians are using the trauma-based and trauma-informed CBT, we need to focus on the cognitive distortions, and we need to do a lot of cognitive restructuring. Okay, when we look at the cognitive restructuring, that can help us as we restructure the thoughts. We can kind of manage and magnify that behavior and put it to the forefront as to how the minimization, the selective abstraction, the dichotomous thinking is driving the gambling behavior, which also has driven other behaviors such as ADHD. She also talked about how ADHD and bipolar, that more than likely people who are diagnosed with gambling addiction, they have had these impulse control behaviors most of their life, particularly they start in adolescence or pubescence. We talked about the 90% of people who will not get treatment for gambling disorder. We also are going to talk about how the behavioral health diagnosis that they have without even addressing the gambling disorder. What does she mean by that? Well, what we mean by that is they'll get stuck on addressing the ADHD. They'll get stuck on addressing the ODD. They'll get stuck on addressing any impulsive behavior, but they will not address the gambling. We have to be better in using the few diagnostic tools we have. As I said, the SOARS, South Oaks Gambling Screener. We have to use those. Those can be self-administered, so you don't have to be a clinician to administer or interpret those, but it'll tell you a lot about it. And I challenge you to put those in your intakes. As a clinician, and as long as I've been a clinician, I don't have those in my intake packets, but I look for the impulsivity and behavior before I introduce those screeners. And I look at the behavioral problems. Also, we have to look at the correlation between people who are diagnosed with gambling disorder and people who are diagnosed with other contagious diseases, such as they have chronic STDs or STIs, sexually transmitted infections, or they are positive for HIV. And that has to do with the risk-taking behavior. People who gamble have risk-taking behavior that they are a part of. We have to know the difference between skill-based gambling and chance-based gambling. I think she did a great job of explaining that, and that how that was discussed in the video. Skill-based gamblers are often decriminalized because they are your poker players. That means that you have to have a skill. We watch World Series of Poker. There are poker tournaments. Just because a person is a really great professional poker player does not mean that they don't have an addiction, or don't meet the diagnostic criteria for gambling disorder. She also talked about the impulsiveness in relation to the chance gambler. The chance gambler is the person, more than likely, it is more so a woman. They're impulsive. They like the slot machines. Okay, they like the sounds of the bingo machine. And they like how it lights the brain up, and it lights the endorphins in the brain, and it gets the serotonin and the dopamine moving in the brain. And sometimes they have a higher risk of addiction, as she stated in the video, because of how the brain processes poker. For your action gamblers, most of your action gamblers are men, and most of them are people who like the action of it all. The skilled gamblers, the poker players, how the brain processes that behavior. And the dangerous part about all of these behavioral based addictions is because they are so pleasurable. One of the things that we talked about is how action gamblers, again, are high among men, but a lot of times they gamble because the action is stimulating. They are the men who find life boring. A lot of times they have to always feel like someone is constantly stimulating them. A lot of times I would, just go ahead to say they probably are engaging in a lot of masturbation, because they always have to be stimulated. And if you are working with a problem gambler and someone who chronically masturbates, there is a correlation between that, as Dr. Weiss spoke of in his video of gambling, because it's the constant stimulation. It's the constant need to always feel like you're being stimulated. Okay, one of the things that you need to know about pathological gambling, it was moved from pathological to a full-blown disorder in the last probably 3 to 4 years. And that has to do with, as she said in the video, she doesn't know if that's good or bad. I feel like it's good because it gives us as clinicians a way to tell people you have a disorder. It was very difficult because gambling and as well as sex addiction are so pleasure-based that people would accept these as problems or a leading diagnostic criterion for a disorder. But they are categorized in the substance-related and addictive disorder section of the DSM-5-TR, and they have been added to that category because people are starting to recognize the addictive nature and the process behavior, how people are behaviorally processing these addictions, as opposed to just assuming that the addiction is only substance related. One of the other things that we're going to talk about, and now I want you to look at on your PowerPoint, the next slide, is questions for screening. As I said, we have the South Oaks Gambling Screener. We also have the National Opinion Research Center Diagnostic Screener for gambling disorders. And we have to look at the cause, but not just the results of gambling. On the third slide of tonight's presentation is, these are the questions that you need to ask people. You don't have to be a master's level person to ask this. Have you ever borrowed money in order to gamble or lost money? Have you ever thought you might have a gambling problem or been told that you might have a gambling problem? Have you ever been untruthful about the extent of your gambling and how much you have won or lost? Have you hidden it from others? Some of the other questions that I think were good on a PowerPoint. Have you ever tried to stop, cut back, and you couldn't? The more and more I ask those questions about gambling and screening, it sounds very similar to addiction, doesn't it? We ask the same questions in relation to a person who's addicted to a substance. Those same questions on slide 3, very same questions that are asked. Uh, and one of the things she talked about again in treatment issues was cognitive behavioral work. She talked a lot about Gamblers Anonymous. There's not a lot of Gamblers Anonymous groups. Um, there, you can call a number called 1-800-BETS-OFF. That is the hotline in Iowa. Sometimes you can just Google it, but gambling addiction has not gotten the attention that other addictions, such as substance-related addictions to drugs, alcohol, or cocaine or methamphetamines, it has not gotten that same recognition. Again, because it is so pleasurable. One of the things that they talk about on page 194 in the textbook, they use an example of the lady named Julie. I think that is a great example. They talked about a social work major working in the casino. In the state of Michigan, there is a gambling unit for the state of Michigan that works in the casinos. I know a few people on that unit. And they try to intervene when people have become too addicted in the casino. One of the other things that they talked about, how casino owners insist that they do not want to attract problem gamblers, but we know that's not true. One of the reasons is very obvious. There's no windows in casinos. It's no clocks. But right now, in the last 3 years, gambling has changed, particularly in the state of Michigan. We have all of the gambling bets and apps. Fantasy football has turned into just legal gambling. People will have their own fantasy football leagues, but you can go and vote, gamble at the casinos with them. When we look at gambling activities, we have to conclude that what the slot machine is doing for people. The slot machine, as the textbook talked about, it is the electronic morphine. On page 197, I'll read. Studies that look at addiction potential of different types of gambling activities conclude that machine gambling is associated with the greatest harm to gamblers. Why is that? The dopamine receptors, the brain is consistently looking for pleasure, and the morphine, dopamine is like electronic morphine to the brain, and it's just shooting that dopamine to a higher level. Some of the terms that they talked about was the crack cocaine of gambling. You can look at dopamine in that manner. Electronic morphine, the most violent strain of gambling in the history of man. No other form of gambling manipulates the human mind as beautiful as these machines. And those are all quotes from page 197. One of the things, because the gaming video was so important, as we look at treatment issues, treatment for cognitive work and motivational therapy, they like to use a lot of MI, motivational interviewing. I talk a lot about MI. They like to use a lot of that. And the irrational thinking about winning is something that you would need to address in treatment. How you can't always, think you're going to win, but remember, people who are using gambling and have a gambling disorder are addicted, and you have to look at where they are on the spectrum, and they first have to recognize that there is a problem, and they can't think that they just had a bad day. And what we always look at, how is the person's level of functioning inhibited? How has their life changed? How are they managing what their daily lives? Can they pay for gas? Can they pay for food? It's a lot of different things we have to look at. Demographic factors that the textbook looked at, even though we talked about this earlier. The textbook on page 201 talks about a survey that was done, and it had a low rate of gambling involvement, but the blacks had a high rate of gambling problems when they did gamble. For African Americans, more Native Americans gambled than did any other group, and they have had the most gambling problems. As you know, in the state of Michigan, there are probably about 11 casinos, and I think about 5 of them are on Indian reservations because of the Indians' relationship with the government and being sovereign land. So many of them are there. It also talked about Asians were the least likely to be involved in gambling, and Asians who did engage in gambling often developed serious problems. It found that Hispanic persons were more than likely to exhibit problem or pathological gambling as opposed to whites. This is research that I think has completely changed. It's in the textbook and it was listed from around 2011 and between 2018. But now everyone has access to gambling. I do like how in the video that we posted, the 9 signs of problem gambling by Dr. Donna Lee Snipes, how she talked about adolescence and how it's harder for kids to get access to gambling, but that has changed. If children have access to a phone, they have access to gambling. She talked about in the video that most of them couldn't get money. We know money is liquid now, all Cash App, Venmo, Zelle, a lot of parents have them on it. So children do have access to it. There is a significant gender difference. Again, women are more so relief gamblers. Men are more so action gamblers or your skill gamblers. There was in the textbook some research about the differences in gender and how gambling is looked at as psychological pain management. Okay, and women gamblers are more than likely to be middle-aged women who are just looking to get divorced, widow, looking to just get away, and they have higher levels of stress and have lower annual income than males. Many people who gamble, who have the money to gamble, do not always see gambling as an addiction. They don't see it as a problem as a problem because they have the resources. Page 203 does a good job looking at many reasons as to why impulse control disorder, substance related and addictive disorders in the DSM-5 are how they're neurologically overlap with the research in relation to gambling and substance disorders. And you know, one of the things I think I showed you, or one of the videos may show you, how you take the brain of someone addicted to crack cocaine or cocaine, and you take the brain of someone that's addicted to gambling, and the brain and the neurotransmitters, they light up in the same area, and that the dopamine and that reward system and that impulsivity, you know, all the traits people have that are common, whether it's male, female, socioeconomic, is that they all have impulsivity. Impulsivity is the key marker in both gambling and substance use disorder. So when we accept that impulsivity is the gambling, is the marker, then we can look at and consider if the person has a gambling disorder, primarily because we can then look at the behavior. And so I'm challenging you to not just think of bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder. I'm challenging you to look at the continuum of addiction in a different way, meaning that look at addiction from a behavioral standpoint and don't always think that these behavioral addictions are common, that they're related to impulsivity, and that automatically means that it's an ADHD. It is the reward system. One of the videos I showed earlier in the semester, where we were talking about the brain and the limbic system, you know, Maslow's hierarchy of need is pretty much the first physiological needs, the first tier, food, water, and shelter. And the gentleman that did the video, as well as myself, said we need to add dopamine in there. And so when we look at the trait, it is understood that impulsivity is understood as an imbalance between an overactive subcortical reward system, that reward system in the brain. And we have a lot of that here in the world now, where people automatically feel that they should always be rewarded. They should always be rewarded. They should always be rewarded. And life just doesn't work like that. Again, in the text, page 203, they talk about the problem gamblers show a reduction in the dopamine 2 receptor of the brain, and how this is similar to someone that is addicted to a substance. They also have a heightened level of dopamine release, and it can correlate to other long-term brain degenerating diseases such as Alzheimer's and Parkinson's over time. And that makes sense to me. Another clue that gambling addiction is quite similar is to substance use addiction is the pharmaceutical treatments appear to work for both problems. So when we look at what we treat ADHD with and what we treat when we use our selective SSRIs, or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, when we look at all of that, we can see how it will work. Looking at how it will work together, because it is regulating the brain the same way it would regulate opioid receptors, SSRIs, as I said. It will also help treat gaming and gambling addiction.